raw, uncut, and unapologetic. Welcome to Men Talking Mindfulness with your hosts John Macaskill and Will Schneider. Here we focus on helping men and those with men in their lives solve some of life's complex challenges through understanding the practices of mindfulness and how they can help. Each episode is in an environment free of judgment and criticism, with a focus on authenticity and inner peace. Let's dig in.
Welcome to Men Talking Mindfulness. I'm John Macaskill, and I'm joined by my co-host over there, Will Schneider. Men Talking Mindfulness is a podcast where we explore how mindfulness can help people live more fulfilling and balanced lives. Today, we are joined by Dr. Mark Bertin, a developmental pediatrician, author, and leading expert on the intersection of mindfulness and ADHD. Dr. Bertin, very happy to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me here.
It's going to be a great conversation. So ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects both children and adults, and symptoms can vary. We will get into that in the show. While medication and behavioral interventions are commonly used to treat ADHD, there is increasing evidence that mindfulness can be a helpful complementary approach to manage symptoms and improve quality of life. Dr. Bertin has been working with individuals with ADHD for over 20 years and is the author of several books, including Mindful Parenting for ADHD and How Children Thrive, the Practical Science of Raising Independent, Resilient, and Happy Kids. He is also a mindfulness teacher and regularly trains parents, educators, and healthcare professionals on how to integrate mindfulness into their work with individuals with ADHD. In today's episode, we'll explore the benefits of mindfulness for individuals with ADHD, how mindfulness can be practiced in everyday life, and how parents and caregivers can support children with ADHD using mindfulness techniques. Dr. Bertin will also discuss any potential limitations or considerations. I see you smiling. You're like, hey, you're putting a lot of pressure on me.
So
we're going to discuss any potential limitations or considerations for using mindfulness as a treatment for ADHD. So go grab yourself a cup of tea, find a comfortable seat, and as we prepare to dive into the world of mindfulness and ADHD with Dr. Mark Bertin. And I see Will change that cup of coffee into a cup of tea, I think, because I think it originally said cup of coffee. But first, I want to say hello to my brother from another mother, my co-host, Will Schneider. Brother, over to you.
Hey, Mark, thanks for joining us. Thanks, everyone, for coming out for the show today. I'm really excited to talk about ADHD because there's a lot of it out there in the world. It seems like it's growing because of technology, which we can talk about as well. But let me ask you, John, and Mark, if anyone out there listening, is it time to get away, to unplug from the emails, the social media, all the digital chaos? Imagine yourself in a serene, nature-filled environment, releasing from stress and anxiety, and hitting reset, rejuvenating your body, your mind, your soul, and having fun. This could be you if you sign up for our Mindfulness Adventure Retreat coming up in upstate New York on May 18th to the 21st. We're going to breathe, we're going to move, we're going to get mindful during these 4-day and 3-night immersive experience that includes a 4-week integration program after the retreat. So if you want to learn more about it and sign up before all the spots are gone, you can head to mentalkingmindfulness.com/retreat to book your spot before they're gone. Once again, it's mentalkingmindfulness.com/retreat. And if you want to get mindful a little bit more, we have a free mindfulness workbook. And you can subscribe also to our newsletter by simply texting mindful to 33777. That's mindful, text to 33777. Hey, and thanks for helping us to grow the show, leaving comments, taking a screenshot right now, and just say, hey, I'm becoming more mindful because of Men Talking Mindfulness. And, we're growing on YouTube, so thanks for getting up on our YouTube. We actually hired an editor to help us to cut up the show in snackable snippets that you can munch on when you need them. So subscribe. The link is youtube.com/@Men Talking Mindfulness. And that's all I have, John. I'm just going to jump right into the grounding practice.
Let's do it.
And we'll get talking with Dr. Mark Bertin. So we're just going to do a simple 5-breath relaxation exercise. We're going to do a nice little parachute breath. So we're going to really take like a really strong inhale. I'll guide us through this. And we're going to take a long, long, long exhale out the mouth. And on those exhales, just really imagine yourself and even experience yourself just relaxing your face, your jaw, your shoulders, and grounding a little bit more into your seat or into your feet. We're going to do 5 of those. So create a nice comfortable seat. Maybe keep your eyes open or closed depending what you need, or you can do this while you're driving. But let's exhale out your mouth. Push all the breath out. Empty, empty. Pull the navel in to extinguish all the breath. Take that really strong inhale and exhale out slow. We're kind of like a deflating a tire, if you will. Good. Inhale again. Now you really feel the relaxation that comes right through just exercising a longer exhale. Again, in. Slower if you can. Drifting down to the earth from a parachute, right into this moment. 2 more. Great. The last one in. Let it go. Just take a little short moment of silence. Find that breath, nice and smooth breath in and out. Notice if anything has changed just in those few breath cycles, just by manipulating your breath and getting hold of yourself and grabbing a little more hold of the moment in your mind by breathing, slowing down your breath. All right, slowly come back. You can wiggle fingers and toes or make some movements in your shoulders, your head, your neck, and awesome, we're here. John, where would you like to start?
Well, for Dr. Bertin, we hear a lot about ADHD, and 10, 15 years ago it was ADD, now it's ADHD. So let's start here. What is ADHD? What causes it? And what are the symptoms of ADHD?
Well, 2 or 3 bullet points. One is I think they intentionally mix up the textbooks periodically just to confuse everybody. So what we have to say is, like, right now, cutting edge is that there is just this umbrella term ADHD that includes what we used to call ADD. So just for the terms of today's talk, ADHD encompasses all of that. There's a subtype, or you're supposed to say predominantly. Some people have hyperactive symptoms. Other people have the more internal inattentive symptoms. So in terms of terminology, right now we're supposed to say ADHD for all of it. Rumor has it the next time they revise the big diagnostic manual, that's going to change again. So for now, colloquially people use ADHD or ADD, and that's fine. But the textbook, like when I'm talking today, it's all ADHD. So ADHD is a medical disorder that's pretty well confirmed. It can be misdiagnosed, like a lot of clinical medicine, but when correctly diagnosed, it's a medical condition in which actually a much larger skill set than attention, called executive function, which is kind of like your self-management skills, is not doing its job fully. So executive function, with parents sometimes I just kind of shorthand it that anything in life that needs management, if you can put the word management to it, it probably involves a lot of executive function. So it's like the brain CEO. You have to manage your attention, you have to manage projects, you have to manage time, you have to manage emotion. All of that's executive function related. So when someone has ADHD, they're struggling with some aspect of executive function. Part of the reason in the latest diagnostic manual they've made it all one term is it just tends not to be very clean. So some people have a mishmash, and some people it changes situationally, and it changes as you grow up. So that's why they sort of dropped the specific subtypes, because it was never all that straightforward. So what that means practically, the reason it's important to talk about ADHD is that it's very common. So in spite of all the sort of fearfulness about it, it's been diagnosed in different ways for at least a century, or if not more. It's not that new. The diagnostic rate is actually very consistent if you diagnose it correctly. In children, it's about 1 in 15, more or less.
Wow.
And the most important point, the single most important point, I think, for either kids or adults who think they might have ADHD, everyone gets distracted sometimes, everyone gets disorganized sometimes, everyone has their strengths. But impairment is part of the diagnosis, and that's the most important part of the whole discussion. Individually, it has to be affecting you, significantly enough that you're chronically struggling in some aspect of life. It could be as in childhood, obviously school is the first thing that often comes to mind, but it could be as subtle as you're getting reasonable grades or you're doing well in life overall, but internally you're just chewing yourself up with stress and anxiety because you're constantly compensating for all of the challenges that poor executive function causes. And then I'll just say one other thing about that, and then I'll pause. I'm curious what questions you have, but the concept, the reason it's important to look at ADHD as a disorder of executive function is it includes attention and behavior as a start, but also includes organization, planning, time management, and emotion in a very big way, so that for adult ADHD in particular, the struggles can be largely with time, planning, undermining yourself through that type of challenge over and over and over again.
Yeah, thanks. I wonder if we can dive in a little deeper into two parts of this. The mental game, like what does that mental chatter like look like, or like sound like, or what is your typical experience with the people you work with that mental chatter, and then going into the emotional realm, like what does that look like, but also what are the, on both sides, I guess, like I'd imagine that whether it's like more of like a narrative or a mental game that's going on, or an emotional game, like there is some sort of, it drives some sort of behavior. I wonder if we can kind of talk a little and clear that up a little bit more. Wonderful.
I love that question, although I would almost break it into three different things when you look at it that way.
Please do.
Because from a starting, so the narrative is really important. It's a big issue. It's a big challenge for many people living with ADHD. But I would start, on a very practical level. One of the most important things to look at in supporting a child with ADHD or understanding ADHD, if you're an adult with ADHD, is really looking at executive function like a concrete skill set. It sort of depersonalizes it almost. These are the skills we use to manage day-to-day life when things are new or difficult, to problem solve, and it's very easy to dismiss them. It's very common. People look at it as motivational, or if you cared enough, you'd work harder, that type of stuff. Or if I cared enough, I'd work harder. Or how come I'm always, making these careless mistakes? Carelessness is an ADHD symptom. So really, there's three different things there, because I sometimes talk about it as if someone has ADHD, it's just terminology, but it's just the way of framing it. You want to problem solve through this lens of executive function. Like, what if we can just take away the judgment and blame and just say, these are skills that are behind, just like somebody else might have a knee injury they're rehabbing from, or somebody else, if you're talking about children, might have a significant language delay. It's frustrating, it's upsetting, but you don't blame anybody for it. So with executive function, there's this other layer of blame and judgment that can be diffused a little bit if you just say, like, you look at something like chronically running late. It's like, that isn't because you don't care. That's because mismanaging time is part of ADHD. And that shift in perspective can be pretty epic. I had a situation, not even a situation, but it was actually quite, when we say it that way, it sounds negative, but I had a lovely moment with a family sometime last year or two that I've been talking about a lot, where they had a child who was kind of volatile, all over the place, lots of tantrums. And all I had gotten to up until that point was just sort of describing to them what executive function was. They came back within a week or two for their next follow-up and said, things are already a little better at home. And they were clearly joking. And I was like, wow, I haven't even done anything yet. What's possibly better at home? And they said, well, now that I understand that, their impulsivity and emotionality is a symptom of ADHD, I realize they're not trying to get my goat. So it's just we're just getting along better. Now what can we do about it? So nothing had actually improved, but just that shift. It's actually kind of relates to mindfulness. It's like letting go of all the assumptions and just seeing it more clearly. It allowed them to drop a lot of extra that was complicating the situation and focus on what they actually could do to improve things. Which is all on some level mindfulness. So that's one thing, is that I think you really do have to look at executive function not as a narrative or the choice in particular, but it is literally your problem solving and planning skills. And that's, so if those another nuance of ADHD is, since executive function are the skills used to plan and persist, if you have ADHD, managing your own ADHD is inherently hard, because it's a very unique situation. The skills you would use to get on top of ADHD are the ones that are undermined by ADHD. So it's a very challenging situation. So that's part one. I would say I'll talk about emotion second. Knowing that you guys, like me, are mindfulness practitioners, we could probably spend the whole session just talking about the emotional part, which is to say that emotional reactivity is inherently part of ADHD. So we all experience emotion all the time, and you need a strong brain manager to sort of notice and catch those emotions before they're out in the world. So you need to manage them, right? So they're not going to go away. But if you're living a life where that reactivity is just front and center all the time, that means a lot of kids with ADHD, a lot of adults with ADHD struggle with kind of extremes of emotion in any direction. Poor frustration tolerance, big tempers, crying really easily, all of which, can be really disruptive. Other thing we can come back to, that mindfulness can be specifically supportive with. So emotion is the second thing. And then that narrative, I think it's a whole other discussion. I'm not sure this is exactly the question you're asking, but the way I would think about it is, Russell Barkley, who's like the guru in the field, has this famous quote about ADHD, that it's not a disorder of not knowing what to do, it's a disorder of not doing what you know. In other words, you know exactly what's supposed to happen in a given situation. Your brain manager isn't quite doing its job, so you forget, or you get distracted, or you get impulsive, or you lose track of time, or all these. But it's not that you don't know better. And that has, in terms of that inner dialogue and narrative we all live with, that has some pretty intense implications. It means, as a child, you may be growing up getting corrected and not getting the grades you should, and getting in trouble and all this stuff constantly, and yet exactly what you should be doing in any situation. You have the best intentions. And in terms of that sort of narrative inner dialogue we have, that has big implications. And I think that's another area mindfulness can be very supportive, because we can start working with that habit of being, overly self-critical, overly self-doubting, and that gets in the way of, it all sort of ties together, because in order to be resilient and manage your ADHD, you have to have a strong foundation to begin with. And if your inner critic and all this internalized dialogue of having a hard time becomes too prominent, that gets in the way of, all the other things you have to do in life.
We had Kristen Neff on a few episodes ago,
cool.
and we talked a lot about self-compassion, and it sounds like that's where you're going, and how important that self-compassion, and that mindfulness, that is a practice in and of itself. Self-compassion is a mindfulness practice. So can you touch on how important that self-compassion is?
Yeah, sure. I would actually look at it two ways, and I think it's an interesting thing to explore a little bit. On some level, self-compassion is just part of all mindfulness practice, which I think is an important nuance that gets missed. Every time you sit down to do anything, you want to be aware of that tendency to say, like, I suck at this, I can never get it, my mind's always and so every time you sit and practice, part of the practice is you're going to get distracted. It's okay. How would you coach a child? It's like, great job trying, just do your best, come back, it gets better over time. All of that is part of any mindfulness practice. There's just this aspect of self-compassion. And then Kristen Neff's self-compassion itself, which is sort of pulling from these centuries-old practices and really creating a structured approach to focusing only on self-compassion. Well, not only, but part of self-compassion is a specific practice has huge value because, I mean, there's 2 or 3 different things. I mean, just so you know, I don't remember if we touched on it. I don't think you mentioned it in the intro. The most recent project I did was actually with someone who worked with Kristen to do a lot of research with teens.
Oh, beautiful.
We decided that, so we have a book on teen self-compassion and ADHD that's out, because with teenagers who are often struggling with self-criticism and self-doubt and all those things to begin with, if you add on ADHD, it becomes, overwhelming and immense. I mean, it becomes gigantic. And so to come back around to,
I'd imagine, Mark, with children and ADHD, that it would really mess with their self-confidence in some ways. If you have not only the inability to really, be more present in the moment and get on task and do your job, and then you have the emotional aspect, which is like, telling you that you're a bad person, you're not a good student, you're not a good son, or, whatever, and all that, like, emotional hijacking, that it can really mess with, self-confidence. Do you see that with the children that you work with? And is self-compassion kind of a way out of that realm?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some research saying that kids with ADHD are being corrected like at a 3-to-1 ratio more than they're being praised by the time they hit kindergarten.
Wow.
And it's nobody's fault exactly, because they do, that's the thing. It's like, this is why it's so hard. You got to get on top of ADHD because they do need the redirection. They are distracted and off task. They are acting impulsively. But how do you then shift that back to a more positive experience for them? I think, like everything around mindfulness, you don't want to oversell the mindfulness part. I want to put it in context. I mean, I just want to say, even if it's not the focus for today's session, that part of the answer clearly is, a really comprehensive intervention for ADHD overall, whatever that looks like individually. It's not that mindfulness is replacing all of that. It's supporting all of that. A lot of addressing ADHD has to do with really working hard on forming new habits and habit change, whether it's like how you manage your emotions, how you manage time, how you manage routines. So that type of intervention is clearly much harder when you're lacking, when your mindset's off, when you're down on yourself, when your self-confidence has been affected, when you've started to doubt, the concept of mindset is one where, this goes for adults as well as kids. Obviously, I'm a developmental pediatrician, so I often speak through the lens of working with kids. It's basically understanding that it's our effort and persistence that are what we control most and makes the biggest difference in life. And when we raise kids who feel that way, they tend to be able to overcome challenges more easily, or at least stick with it when the challenges arise. And that's the sort of stuff that ADHD is undermining constantly. Your mindset, your self-image are getting affected until we set up a world where you're going to, on the one hand, do the interventions that help you actually experience success. And then that's a long roundabout way of getting back to what you're saying. And then we can more actively work with the implications by, actually doing adding in mindfulness and self-compassion practice as a way of bolstering our overall resilience, helping us feel a stronger sense of well-being so that we can kind of foundationally really address any problem, more skillfully, but certainly when it comes to ADHD, understand it objectively for what it is, which helps with the problem-solving side of it, and then work on the overly loud inner critic and self-confidence that you're talking about through self-compassion practice makes a very big difference too. Do you want to define? We haven't defined the practice for anyone who didn't watch Kristen Neff's.
Yes, let's do that.
Please. And I'm so excited that you're working with her. Like, that's awesome.
It's one of her.
This
intersection.
Who works
with her.
It's amazing.
It's one of her team people. I've met Kristen. It's with Karen Booth, who's a teen researcher who's worked with Kristen.
Okay.
So self-compassion practice, I think it's important. I have a feeling, particularly for your audience, to really define what that term means, because it sounds so, I don't know what. The term itself can be, kind of wishy-washy sounding.
Sure.
But I think it's very realistic, and I think it's important to put in that context. I mean, the basics when it comes to self-compassion as a practice is the recognition that we tend to be, infinitely harder on ourselves mentally than we would be with anybody else we're close with. You can do that if you want to do like a 30-second exploration of that. You can just picture like if you're about to walk to the front of an auditorium to give a talk in front of a bunch of people, and you totally face planted, coffee and papers flying everywhere, total wipeout. Just catch yourself for a second and just try to picture like what's your first thought you would have in that moment, and your first thought, for yourself tends to be something like, whatever negativity we all have, you always do this, fill in the, whatever profanity you use for yourself, they're all staring at you. It's like this pile of negativity is like the reflex that happens right away. If you put yourself sitting in the front row and your best friend is walking up to do that same thing and totally wipes out papers and coffee everywhere, what's that gut level instinct? The gut level instinct is like, it's okay. Take a second, they're all on your side, it's going to be fine. It's just instinctual. That's how you would treat a child or your closest friend in life. So self-compassion practice, kind of counterintuitively, is a practice where you're trying counterintuitively, in that it's something not natural for many people until they start practicing it, is recognizing that you can learn to treat yourself with that same sense of balance. It doesn't, people are often afraid it's going to like undermine their motivation, undermine problem solving. All of Kristen Neff's research shows that it actually improves your sense of well-being. It improves your ability to stick with problems as they get hard. It improves your ability to recover from mistakes. And the basic practice is, 1 in 3 parts, which is kind of folding into your typical mindfulness practice. The 3-part practice, very briefly, is focusing first on mindfulness itself, which I think is an interesting discussion. I think just giving ourselves permission to accept and experience, like, this is what I'm feeling right now, is kind of self-compassion, because we often spend an awful lot of effort trying to pretend we're feeling or otherwise, or ignore things we don't like, or I shouldn't be angry at my kids right now, or I shouldn't be so overwhelmed right now, anyone else can handle this. So mindfulness itself is, not a small piece of being self-compassionate. That's part 1. The second part, which I think is equally important, is what she calls common humanity, which is saying that in that moment of screwing up or crisis, we tend to isolate ourselves. Like, I'm the only person who, fill in the blank, whatever anybody else would have. So the common humanity part is really important, because it's actually literally saying to yourself, or it's not really saying to yourself, because that can sound kind of pointed, but it's more just reminding yourself, like, everyone has moments like this. Just everyone has their challenges, and that's a really powerful thing for a lot of people. And then the third part
described it as Kristen Neff described the common humanity as a source of wisdom as well. Just reminding ourselves that we're connected to a whole, and we're not the last or first person, or even the person in this moment in the world that is suffering in this way.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed. Thank you for bringing that up, and I really appreciate. I know we're going to talk about the third part, but just talking about self-compassion here, because it is such an incredible skill once you begin to develop it, to help you to get beyond those negative voices, those actions, and some of the habits that are triggered once we're in kind of a negative head and feeling place.
Yeah, and I think Kristen's alluding to something there, which is the common humanity part leads to another. I found it. I think it's an important part of understanding mindfulness to me, is that it's not really meant to be. It's not really a self-help practice. It's meant to just recognize that when we are feeling more aware and more self-confident and more grounded, that changes the world around us. The whole practice. So that what she's alluding to there is the recognition that everyone's struggling is a pretty profound one, because it changes how you treat other people too. Which isn't part of the self-compassion practice specifically, but is, really, really important. Especially, you want to sometimes, as a parent, if you're going to take time to do something for yourself, it helps to, connect with it motivationally, in a sense. And, so the fact that our own practice influences our families, influences how we relate to our kids is a really important perspective, because otherwise it can just feel like it's certainly not meant to be a selfish practice in any way. It's meant to really acknowledge that the interconnectedness is. I always catch myself. Sometimes joke because my family's from the Bronx, so when I say things, it's like, wait, now that sounded, but
Hey,
interconnected.
you got to practice some self-compassion. You're doing great.
Exactly. No, I know I wasn't. Yeah, exactly. And it's also just like that just sounds like a buzzword, but it's meant to be very literal. I mean, if we're feeling negative and reactive and crappy about ourselves, that changes how we treat other people. And
Right.
that's just literally true. And then the third part of the practice, which is very, very different and really I think needs to be approached kind of in a nuanced way, is the reminder, like, can I just find kindness for myself in this moment, or can I stay strong in this moment, or whatever feels. You kind of like the words don't matter as much as what connects for you, and that can seem kind of strange too, except that it's not meant to force yourself to feel anything in particular. It's really just meant as a reminder. Like, may I just keep coming back to this possibility that I can treat myself the same way I would somebody I care about. Hope, and that three-part practice over time, really can begin to tone down the what we often call the inner critic and perfectionism in a way that makes life a whole lot easier to manage. Although interestingly, as I was saying that, I realized that I have always felt that sense of the inner critic and perfectionism is one of the biggest things that shifted for me after I don't even know, like 25, 30 years of practicing. And but what's interesting is like I alluded to at the beginning, most of that shift happened long before I came across the self-compassion practice that Kristen teaches specifically. I mean, it is just part of mindfulness practice as a whole, also, to me.
Right. Yeah. Well, what would you prescribe if you were to a self-compassion practice that can ultimately change, that relationship to yourself? Like, with something daily, how much time, because it does have a profound effect, and I just want,
Right.
Let our audience know, that it does take practice and does take consistent practice.
Yeah. Well, that's the bottom line with all mindfulness practice, is just recognizing that it's not a quick fix, and it's actually not always that warm fuzzy message. It's like a gym program almost, of like, these are hard habits to change, and you just, as much as no one wants, it's like it takes some time and effort, but if you practice regularly over a long stretch of time, you do start to change these cognitive habits and how you approach things. So there's no specific answers as much as the consistency. There was a study done in the last couple of years from Dr. Jha that suggested as little as 12 minutes a day begins to show some differences, and I think that's that's a nice benchmark. I think most people can manage that. More might give you more, but 12 minutes a day most people can manage. And it is just about the consistency. It's about letting go of short-term expectations. Very important to let go of perfectionism. Your mind stays busy, your body gets restless, you miss a day here and there. It's all just part of the practice, and it's okay. But you do the best you can to be consistent about it, and you do start to see, various things change over time. So I would just say it's about the daily practice, whatever you pick. It could just be, I think the first practice for many people is like a breathing practice or a body scan often, and that's great. If you want to do Kristen's self-compassion practice, that's equally great. Some of this is just finding what feels right to you in any stretch of time. One of the big reframes that I think can be helpful, or has been helpful, I think, through the pandemic and everything else, is also just recognizing that you're not trying to, specifically relax, or you're certainly not trying to stop thoughts. And one way to reframe it a little bit as a starting point, there's many other aspects to it, but as a starting point, is it's almost a practice of patience, of just recognizing that stuff happens constantly.
Yeah.
Life is up, down, and all over the place. When you look at like what causes stress, they actually describe positive experiences that are different and negative experiences that are different causing stress. So it's just like part of life. And a lot of what you're building through the beginning practice is responsiveness and patience. It's the ability to experience all that and stay in touch with, just a sense of awareness and a sense of, almost a sense of resilience. But it's a meditation practice itself. Those few minutes, you're sort of giving yourself permission to experience whatever's happening without immediately responding to it, without immediately getting caught up into it. some other part of the day, you might want to be very intentional and just take care of a problem that needs solving. But if you come to that from a sense of, what's sometimes talked about is, non-judgmental awareness, just meaning like I'm seeing what's going on with clarity, that really makes a big difference. And mindfulness practice itself, that reframe of like, I can do this because for 12 minutes, it's okay, short of a crisis, I can sit here and be aware of whatever I'm experiencing, and I'm allowing myself permission not to get caught up in my usual stuff. And that begins to make a big difference over time.
What about the flip side? So we're talking about how mindfulness can help, right? So what about the things in our daily lives that get in the way of our practicing mindfulness, and or maybe even exacerbate the ADHD? I know we touched on it very briefly at the beginning. We talked about technology, social media. There's a lot of things that are even designed to distract you or to draw your attention. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Oh, I could talk about that a lot, actually. But I think there's like a lot of things. There's two different ways of looking at it. From the point of view, of mindfulness, one way to define mindfulness is, intentionally building the skills that help us relate to whatever is actually going on, as well as we're able. Because what we tend to do is fall into kind of a state of, reactive autopilot. We're just going to do the same stuff, thinking the same stuff, live in the same way without giving it any attention. And that's just, human nature if we don't put some effort into breaking that habit, breaking that style, right? So one way of looking at it when it comes to technology is that, like you said, it is designed, I think we underestimate, like the intrinsic design is designed to distract and hook your attention, borderline to addict you in a not paranoid way. It is just literally how it was built. Some people in the industry, or people who have left the industry, have described it as like a big experiment gone wrong. It's like they used basic human psychology and then were able to collect so much data that it was way more powerful than they thought it was going to be. And now it's really influencing things. So when you look at mindfulness as aiming to be as aware and intentional as possible, one way to look at it is just technology is here. So how can I, pause and with intention make choices around using it as much as I can so that it's less disruptive. So one is, which I think goes for many aspects of our lifestyle. Like a lot of the things that help us stay strong and resilient aren't like rocket science, or it's not even very new science either. It's just a matter of, with some caring and forgiveness, realizing it's really easy to lose track, but maybe, I do want to shut off my phone at, a certain time so I can get some sleep, or put it aside when I'm having a conversation with a close friend, or do all these sort of moment to moment, more intentional choices that can make a difference. If you're really, I don't want to, I could hijack this whole talk today and just go into technology. I do think on another level, we certainly each individually can make very practical choices that make technology less intrusive, whether it's, how we manage technology during work time, or just cleaning up our phones and shutting off notifications and deleting a lot of extra stuff. So so that's literally less distracting. Although on another bigger level, I really do think it's, increasingly becoming seen as, and hopefully will be defined as soon, a public health issue. I think we just need,
Thank you for saying that.
We just need to make a bigger global decision to manage this stuff differently particularly for the sake of our children, who, I think it is a not trivial part of the teen mental health crisis going on right now. By the way, just to tie it together a little bit to our topic for today, kids with ADHD are even more at risk, because if you have poor self-management skills, difficult ability to manage attention, impulse control issues, self-esteem issues, it's kids with conditions like ADHD and anxiety who struggle even more to use technology well. So it's a challenge for the whole generation, and then it's even more impactful for kids who have things like ADHD.
Is there any science out there that is or research being done that's linking technology and ADHD? Or is that Yeah, please.
No,
ADHD. Yeah.
not really, no. I mean, basically,
Okay.
ADHD, the genetic, I mean, one of the quick summaries of all, I think, of all the medical side of ADHD, although obviously there's a lot more to it, is that the genetics of ADHD are almost as strong as the genetics of height. So,
Wow.
genetic,
Yeah.
I mean, ADHD is a highly genetic disorder, in spite of the perception, in spite of people, casually saying they're a little ADHD. True ADHD, if it's correctly diagnosed, isn't caused by extrinsic factors.
Okay.
It's just like somebody else has asthma or something. So
Right.
now, what happens with this sort of attention-based economy we're living in
Hmm.
is um, it does undermine everybody's attention. I mean, these are skills that everybody has to manage all the time. So it does affect
Right.
everybody in that way. One of the examples I give a lot that I think uh, kind of summarizes it is, if you have a bunch of high school students who are all trying to get their homework done, while jumping over to social media and YouTube, and they're on FaceTime with each other, and there are all these distractions going on, right? I mean, what happens is that for the kids who have strong executive function, it is completely inefficient and not great, and somehow they get to the end of it anyway, right? I mean, the mind can't multitask. Every shift of attention, you lose efficiency, make more mistakes. They're making their homework take way longer than it should. But since they're sort of, for those who are in the realm of typical development, they get there. They get to some end point where like their homework's done. Could have been done probably 30% more effectively with fewer mistakes, but it's done. But within that group, there's probably a student or two who have a learning difference or ADHD. So they're trying to keep up with their friends, and they don't have strong executive function. So when you're struggling with executive function, when you shift over because your friend says, "Hey, check this out," and you shift over to watch whatever they're showing, you get lost for 3 times as long, and you struggle to come back, even more than your peers. So within that group, those kids are struggling even more. And the same thing goes for adults. Like everybody gets pulled and distracted, and it's not great for anybody, but it's different than actually having ADHD.
So, talking about the homework, and I've got children, and they're my oldest is 6, so we're not doing a whole lot of homework yet. We are with the
Yeah.
6-year-old. We're doing some basic reading and some basic math, but my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old not so much. But in the next few years, we're going to be doing that. How can parents or caregivers of children with ADHD start to use the mindfulness techniques to support their child's management of the dysfunction?
Well, I think it's important to put it in context of like how we support children in general and children with ADHD in particular. Because executive function turns out to be a developmental path, just like language, that most people aren't that familiar with. Schools don't seem to be that familiar with it nowadays, in that you're not supposed to have an awful lot of it at 5 or 6. You're supposed to have a bunch more of it by the time you're 16. Turns out typical brain development, this is a useful thing to file away. This part of your brain related to executive function matures until you're 26 or so, mid-20s, which is why
Right.
teenagers are teenagers. It's why teenagers, want to be treated like adults and should be given a lot more freedom, but they're 10 years away from really having a mature brain manager. And that's an important perspective to have as a parent. So when you look at it from the point of view of with or without ADHD, it's a way of acknowledging that, like, we have to teach kids how to, manage their homework. We have to teach kids how to manage their emotions for the most part, because it's a skill set to develop. So, so to tie those two thoughts together, some people feel like you can describe ADHD, thumbnail it as like a 1/3 delay in executive function. So if you have a 6-year-old, some districts give lots and lots of homework nowadays. One way to look at that is, well, what 6-year-old should be getting lots and lots of homework? From an executive function point of view, as a parent, it's like, oh, well, of course they're gonna, be all over the place managing, and of course they're gonna procrastinate, and of course it's like, of course, that's the executive function piece, right?
Right.
So part of teaching kids, there's many aspects to executive function. With or without ADHD, it's important to recognize that just routines and consistency and problem solving, why it's not working, are a big part of teaching kids organization and time management skills. They're relying on us to do. I mean, it's a bell curve. If you have a child who's intuitively good at it, that's awesome. But for most part, it means, how do you teach them how to manage their homework when they're young? You set up a good time, you reinforce that time consistently, you maybe set up a reward system to sort of diffuse some of the fighting over it. As they get older, you can add in study skills to that sort of, just this growing structural support around things like, this is what we do. We get our, we work before we play. You can take a break after school, then we're going to get your homework done, then you can go play. If you do that at 6, it's more likely to be a routine at 12. If someone has ADHD, it's the same model. You just got to throw in the developmental delay perspective of now you have a 6-year-old who's getting more homework than the average first grader, might be getting, different generation. I always feel like I need to say at this point, my whole family are special ed teachers except for me. So I'm not saying anything negative about schools and teachers. It's just the reality of the environment right now.
Right.
But if you have a 6-year-old who's getting, in a really demanding school district, getting more homework, which the recommendation is no more than 10 minutes a day, typically for a first grader, and then their executive function skills are behind, that's how you have to approach it. All right, if your ability to do this is more like a 4-year-old right now, there's a whole intervention, a whole series of things we can do to help catch you up over time when you have ADHD. There's behavioral things to talk about, there's medical things you can talk about, there's educational interventions you can talk about. It's very complex and individualized. But while we're waiting for you to catch up, basically kids are relying on the adult brain manager in the room, the adult executive function in the room, to just make it into a routine that's going to help you manage that. And then it becomes, it's a little bit, this one piece of ADHD can sound trite almost, of routines matter, except you can write a whole book on all the nuances of all the different parts of life we have to learn to manage that way. But a lot of that one part of it, which goes all the way to studying as a high school student, comes down to just reinforcing the right routines until they become routine almost.
Yeah. It sounds like it takes a lot of practice and a lot of repetition, and also as like a teacher or caregiver, a lot of positive reinforcement.
Yes.
It's
patience.
Patience.
Right. Patience, instead of it being because there's also this major comparative thing that happens within the school systems. I mean, I haven't been in school in a very long time, especially at that age, but it's always why aren't you as smart as Sally, or why aren't you reading as good as, Joey? And it's just, I feel, that patience must be really, enforced, but yeah.
And Dr. Bertin, you mentioned earlier that mindfulness is just that. It's a practice in patience. So yeah. I mean, it's kind of that equation there, right? Mindfulness helps to increase patience, and patience is going to help with either as a parent of a child with ADHD, or for the child, him or herself, managing that patience. I don't know if I have children with ADHD. That's my next question for you. Is how and when do you know? I mean, I've got a 4-year-old that's he's a little boy. He bounces off the walls.
Okay.
But I'm not going to say that he has ADHD. He's 4 years old, and I think that's what most 4-year-olds do. Talk about that common humanity, right? When do you, as a parent caregiver, start to get concerned and maybe seek out some help?
I think the way I usually summarize that is there is just a huge range of typical development, but you should not be chronically getting in your own way. So at any age, you can diagnose ADHD down to preschool occasionally, knowing that there's a huge range of typical development. But if you see, for a 3 or 4-year-old, it's not that common, but you can find kids who are a constant safety risk, or, can't socialize, or, it's about extremes. So, in younger kids, it's not as subtle sometimes, I think, as you get older. So in young kids, it's there's this huge range of all kids are supposed to be all over the place, but is it so extreme that you're costing yourself problems all the time? As you get older, executive function itself gets more subtle, and then looking for that type of impairment can be much more nuanced. And some of the milder forms of ADHD don't even get picked up until college, because suddenly you need to be independent. For the first time. Well, it doesn't have to be college. Just getting out of the house, I guess, is a better way of saying it. So suddenly you're off on your own, and you until that moment, you don't realize how much you're relying on all the adults around you to keep things structured and together. And that's where you hit that wall of like, oh, and so that, that can be the milder end of things. But that's really it. I think at any age, I think this, kind of, there's no harm, I think, maybe this ties back into self-compassion practice. There's no harm asking for help. We tend to like circle the wagons and not, it's like if your child is just struggling chronically, anywhere, it's worth touching base with your pediatrician or someone to say, hey, what's up? Because, could be a red flag, something's going on.
Good to know. Good to know. All right. Well, Will, I'm done with my questions. You got anything on your end? Anything else?
No, I think, I really thank you for all this information today. Are any mindfulness practices that you'd recommend that can help with ADHD or just finding your breath? I think we talked a little earlier. I think it's interesting that finding that patience or getting more patient requires that relaxation of the nervous system, which the practice of mindfulness or just a simple breathing practice of meditation can help you begin to establish that patience with maybe your struggling child with ADHD, but also if you're someone that struggles with ADHD, I think maybe just with slowing down with your breathing, a good way to help maybe pull you away from some of the impulsiveness of ADHD?
Well, I would take a half step back from that and put it even in the broader context of mindfulness practice is trying to build resilience, is trying to help us manage life. And ADHD is inherently a stress-producing disorder, right? So ADHD, if your brain manager isn't up to speed right now, that makes just day-to-day life more stressful. It very quickly, sort of can escalate into a situation where it's just ADHD is just undermining itself almost, right? So I think one of the reasons I started teaching mindfulness within my medical practice had to do with, I felt like parents' needs weren't being met enough. It was, ADHD is really hard to manage, tough choices to make. You got a behavioral plan you got to stick to. You want to stay patient yourself. All of this is really hard. So it's less about a specific practice as much as just practicing mindfulness itself by, helping us feel more resilient and manage stress opens up the possibility of doing all the rest of ADHD care, with more precision. And I think that goes for adults and kids. So as opposed to sort of prescribing a particular practice, which isn't really what mindfulness is, it's about the consistency. It's whatever practice is going to work for you, do it consistently. And I think that's what matters most. And the perspective around it, there's many specific details we could talk about some other time about, there is some research on mindfulness and attention. There is certainly a lot of research on mindfulness and emotion. But the bigger context here is ADHD is really complicated, really easily makes people feel overwhelmed or overly stressed or overly anxious. And if we can just prioritize that sort of foundational gut level, like let's just work on feeling strong here. Let's just work on the mindfulness part that lets us feel responsive and able to take on things. That's what helps you manage ADHD the most, I think.
There you go. Wow. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bertin, for all this, sharing your knowledge, your wisdom. And I know that this is going to benefit our audience themselves and potentially our audience's family members, their children, their nieces, nephews, whatever the case may be. I know that this is going to be helpful. So thank you very much. That said, as we kind of touched on just before we hit record, we wrap the show up with a grounding practice. And if you're still open to it, I'd love to invite you to offer that grounding practice if you're still open to it.
Absolutely. Let's just maybe I'll just end with 2 or 3 minutes of the sort of breathing practice we alluded to, but as we start and get into it, really looking at the perspective you're taking to the practice itself. That's where a lot of the practice of patience comes from. So wherever you are right now, while you're sitting, you can begin this practice by finding yourself a comfortable posture. If you're driving, keeping your awareness with driving. But for everyone else, find yourself a comfortable posture that you can hold for just a couple of minutes. And as a start, you can begin to notice that there's a little bit of physical motion that your body makes with each breath. So what we're aiming to do as we begin to pull our awareness to that, or guide our awareness to that physical sense of breathing in and breathing out. You might even make a mental label of breathing in and breathing out. But seeing if you can set your intention for these couple of minutes of practice of letting go of any sense of striving or trying to force anything to happen. So your mind will stay busy probably, and something will grab your attention, and then without judging yourself or giving yourself a hard time, just coming back again to the next breath, breathing in and breathing out. And you might take a moment to notice if there's any sense of physical discomfort or tightness anywhere in your body. And if there is, for these next few moments, just noticing it, and unless it's urgent, just observing it and seeing if it passes or changes. It still may be unpleasant, but seeing if you can observe it without needing to react to it or change it unless it's strong enough that it requires your attention right now. And then even in a short practice like this, you might notice what your emotional state is. And we all have habits for when we feel different emotions. We all deal with them different ways. But in that same way, seeing if you can recognize the emotion that's going on right now. And maybe label it and let it be. Some other time during the day, you might do something else. But for now, observing your experience exactly as it is, without any need right now to fix or change or do anything specific at all. And if that becomes overwhelming in any way, simply coming back to breathing in and breathing out. And when you're ready, opening your eyes, and returning your awareness to our virtual classroom or our meeting room today.
Awesome. Yes, Dr. Bertin, thank you again. That was great. That was great.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for the invitation to be here. Good luck with everything.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And best way for our listeners to find you, anything?
Yes.
Coming up,
the easiest way to find me is through my website is developmentaldoctor.com, so that's just the best way. I have actually a lot of resources up there for trying to find factual information about various topics in child development and mindfulness, and that's also the best way to find me.
Great. Well, we'll make sure that is in the show notes when we stream this live and when we push it out next week in podcast form. Dr. Bertin, thank you so much for being with us today. And for our audience, thank you for joining us. And until next time, take care. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you walk away with some new tools and insights to guide you on your life journey. New episodes are being published every week, so please join us again for some meaningful discussion. For more information, please check out mentalkingmindfulness.com.